Air Inter was a semi-public French domestic airline. Before its merger with Air France, the airline was headquartered in Paray-Vieille-Poste, Essonne. Earlier in its life, it was headquartered in the first arrondissement of Paris. Air Inter was incorporated on the 12th of November 1954. It operated its first commercial flight between Paris and Strasbourg on the 16th of March 1958. However, it was 1960 when the airline started regular commercial services. The company established its operational and engineering base at Paris.Air Airport, where its flights were concentrated at Orly West, Orly Airport's West Terminal. Air Inter was founded as a semi-public entity to provide efficient domestic air transport at the lowest cost. Its financial backers included French public and private sector transport businesses in road, rail and air transport, as well as banks. Air France and Société Nationale des Chemins de Fer Français, the state railway company, were Air Inter's two largest public sector shareholders, each holding 25% in the airline. Union des Transports Aériens was its largest private sector investor. UTA initially held a 15% minority stake in Air Inter. UTA subsequently increased its shareholding to 36%, becoming the largest single shareholder. On the 12th of January 1990, Air Inter, with UTA and Air France, became part of an enlarged Air France group, which in turn became a subsidiary of Groupe Air France. Air Inter changed to Air France Europe following a merger with Air France and UTA. On the 1st of April 1997, it was absorbed into Air France. On that day, the firm ceased to exist as a legal entity within Groupe Air France. History. On the 23rd of February 1960, France's Ministry of Public Works and Transport decided to transfer Air France's domestic monopoly to Air Inter. This provided the impetus for Air Inter to start scheduled services within metropolitan France, as well as between the mainland and Corsica. Though a private sector company because of its limited liability status, Air Inter was compelled to operate unprofitable regional domestic routes to justify its domestic monopoly on profitable routes from Paris. Air Inter primarily operated high-frequency scheduled internal flights from Paris-Orly to cities in metropolitan France, principally Lyon, Marseille, Nice, Toulouse, Bordeaux, Strasbourg and Mulhouse. Following the opening of Charles de Gaulle Airport near the northern Paris suburb of Roissy and France and the transfer of the bulk of Air France's international operations from Orly to Charles de Gaulle Airport from 1974, as well as the simultaneous transfer of UTA's Le Bourget-based operation to that airport, Air Inter began serving these routes from Charles de Gaulle as well to feed domestic passengers into those airlines' international networks. Air Inter also linked Orly with additional second- and third-tier provincial French towns as well as with all three commercial airports on Corsica. The airline operated regional domestic scheduled routes between major French cities as well. Many of Air Inter's routes serving smaller towns were contracted to TAT. Prior to the liberalization of the internal air market in the European Union during the early 1990s, Air Inter was a pillar of the French air transport industry with Air France, UTA and TAT. During that period, Air Inter had a large share of the domestic market. It was the only airline plying most of the domestic trunk routes within metropolitan France on a regular scheduled basis, especially from and to Paris. The exceptions were Paris-Nice and Paris-Bâle, Mulhouse. Air Inter's flights between Paris-Orly and Nice competed with Air France's Paris-Charles de Gaulle, Nice, and Orly-Nice flights. Air Inter competed head-on with SwissAir, the former Swiss flag carrier, between Paris-Charles de Gaulle and Bâle, Mulhouse. The difference between the competing Air Inter and SwissAir services on this route was that the former's passengers had to use the terminal at Bâle-Mulhouse Airport through the domestic channel that connected the airport to the French city of Mulhouse, whereas the latters used the international channel that linked the airport with the Swiss city of Bâle. For this reason, Air Inter's flights were categorized as domestic while Swissair's were international. In addition, UTA had limited rights to carry passengers, cargo and mail on the internal legs of its long-haul services between Paris Charles de Gaulle and Lyon, Marseille, Nice, as well as Bordeaux. However, flights were too infrequent to pose a threat to Air Inter. SNCF, one of Air Inter's two largest public sector shareholders, was also the company's main competitor on domestic trunk routes inside France. This intensified when SNCF began high-speed, high-frequency train grande vitesse services on purpose-built tracks from 1981. The launch of TGV services between Paris and Lyon, one of Air Inter's busiest as well as shortest routes, in 1981 led to a reduction in frequency and smaller aircraft on Air Inter's competing service. The only other domestic air routes on which Air Inter competed with Air France in the pre-liberalization era were routes linking the mainland with Corsica. In 1977, Air Inter purchased a 20% stake from Air France in the latter's charter affiliate Air Charter International, in return for ceasing to be a rival supplier of charter airline seats in the French inclusive tour market. Annual passenger numbers on Air Inter's domestic scheduled network grew steadily to 21 million, actually beating Air France 1 year. This established the firm as the largest scheduled domestic airline in Europe. Air Inter was also one of the few European ultra-short-haul, mainline scheduled operators to be profitable most of the time and was a forerunner of today's low-cost airlines in Europe. Fares were lower than domestic airfares elsewhere in Europe and competing rail fares, with short turnarounds, no seat allocation, no frills service on board and minimum crews. On 1 January 1995, Air Inter lost its monopoly on the domestic trunk routes from Paris-Orly. For that day, any EU-based rival was free to compete on these routes, without restrictions on capacity, frequency or fares. The sale of controlling stakes in Air Inter and UTA to Air France, as well as integration of both of the former into the latter, was part of a French government plan to create a unified, national carrier with the economies of scale and global reach to counter threats from the liberalization of the EU's internal air transport market. Fleet. Air Inter pioneered Category 3 all-weather landings and started operating Category 3 minima with caravels, upgrading with enhanced head-up displays on Mercury and A320s. Listed below are the main aircraft types that were part of Air Inter's fleet at one point or another throughout its 37 years of continuous operations: are Aerospatial Caravelle 3 Series, 12 Series, Airbus A300B2, B4 Series, Airbus A320-100 and 200th Series, Airbus A321, Airbus A330-300, Dassault Mercury, Douglas DC-3, C-47, Fokker F-27 Friendship 500 Series, Fokker F-100, Nord 262, Vickers Viscount 700 Series. Air Inter entered the jet age with the Caravelle 3. Air Inter was an early operator of the Airbus A300, the European aircraft manufacturer's first commercial jetliner and the airline's first wide-bodied aircraft. The fleet reached 22 aircraft at its peak, with aircraft being acquired second-hand up to 1992. Air Inter was also a launch customer for the Dassault Mercury, the French answer to the Boeing 737, as well as the Airbus A320, the only airline customer in the world for the former and joint launch customer with Air France and British Caledonian for the latter. The Mercury entered commercial airline service with Air Inter on June 4, 1974. Dassault Aviation's inability to find other customers for the Mercury resulted in the French government granting Air Inter a subsidy of £10,775,000. This helped the airline bear the financial burden of operating an orphan fleet of only 10 aircraft. In addition to the 10 aircraft that formed part of Air Inter's original order for the Mercury, the airline had the aircraft's prototype converted to airline standard as well. This subsequently joined the fleet, increasing the company's Mercury subfleet to 11. It was withdrawn from service in 1995 after 20 years uninterrupted service. The A320 entered service with Air Inter in 1988. The A330 was the last aircraft type to join the Air Inter fleet in 1994. Incidents and accidents. There were 12 recorded accidents involving Air Inter aircraft throughout 37 years of uninterrupted commercial operations, 3 of which were fatal. One of the other 9 reported incidents included an aircraft hijacking, resulting in the loss of 1 life. The airline's 3 fatal accidents were: on the 12th of August 1963, Iveco's Viscount 708 operating a scheduled flight from Lille to Lyon crashed while holding over tramways at FL30 on the instructions of Lyon ATC, resulting in the deaths of the aircraft's 20 occupants as well as 1 person on the ground. A storm forced the flight crew to request ATC permission to descend to FL25. In response, the crew received clearance for a straight-in approach to Lyon-Bron Airport's runway 17. Eyewitnesses reported the aircraft flying low in an easterly direction in the heart of the storm. The aircraft struck trees, the roof of a farmhouse and a telephone pole before coming to rest in a field. The investigation board cited exceptionally bad weather where the aircraft was instructed to hold, as well as the possibility of lightning dazzling the crew and causing temporary blindness or appreciably incapacitating both pilots. On the 27th of October 1972, Iveco's Viscount 724, operating a scheduled night flight from Lyon to Clermont-Ferrand, crashed into the Pic du Pican mountain 44 kilometers east of Clermont-Ferrand Airport at 1,000 feet, killing 60 of the aircraft's 68 occupants, including all 5 crew and 55 of the 63 passengers. The accident was caused by the flight deck crew's failure to notice the plane's radio compass had shifted 180 degrees, most likely as a result of electrical discharges in rainfall blocking the signals emitted by Clermont-Ferrand's non-directional beacon. While being instructed to fly a holding pattern prior to receiving clearance to descend to 3,600 feet, this resulted in the crews initiating the descent too early, which set the aircraft on a collision course with the mountain. On the 20th of January 1992, Air Inter Flight 148, operated by an Airbus A320-111, crashed into a ridge near Mount Saint-Odile in the Vosges Mountains while on final approach to Strasbourg at the end of a scheduled flight from Lyon. This resulted in the deaths of 87 of the aircraft's occupants, the worst accident in company history. There were 9 survivors. The accident was caused by the aircraft's wrongly programmed flight control unit, a consequence of the crew's failure to notice that the FCU was in vertical speed mode when programming the angle of descent. The excessive descent took the aircraft below its minimum safe altitude. This resulted in the aircraft striking trees and a 2,710 feet high ridge in the cloud-covered mountains. The following was a notable, non-fatal incident. On the 28th of December 1971, Vickers Viscount was damaged beyond economic repair at Clermont-Ferrand Airport when it departed the runway on a training flight during a simulated failure of No. 4 engine.